Good morning, beautiful people. It is great to see you all. I hope that you are all doing well. We are in the midst of our study of the Gospel of John, and you may recall by now that the theme of John is believe. We get that from John chapter 20, which we've read so many times, I'm going to spare you reading it again. Basically, John explicitly states that he intentionally picked certain teachings, certain miracles that Jesus did, and recorded those so that we might believe. And we've talked about how, in my opinion, John writes, one, to encourage everyone to believe, but also to continue in belief. For the things that would bring us to belief are also the things that would help us to continue in our belief. And so John writes that we may believe. Today, we're finally out of John chapter 6 because it took us a very long time to get through John chapter 6. And now we're into John chapter 7. John chapter 7, if I can get somebody to read verses 1 through 13 for me, please. John chapter 7, verses 1 through 13.
Seeking to kill him. Now the Jews' feast of booths was at hand. So his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." For not even his brothers believed in him. Jesus said to them, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil. You go up to the feast. I am not going up to the feast, for my time has not yet fully come." After saying this, he remained in Galilee. But after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. The Jews were looking for him at the feast and saying, "Where is he?" And there was much muttering about him among the people, while some said, "He is a good man." Others said, "No, he is leading the people astray." Yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him.
All right, thank you. What can you tell me about the Feast of Booths? In order to have a good picture of John chapter 7, we need to spend a little bit of time talking about what the Feast of Booths is. It's one of those that perhaps you've heard of, but maybe we don't know as much about it as we might like. But before we jump into it, I'm curious, what do you know? What can you tell me about the Feast of Booths, or sometimes referred to as the Feast of Tabernacles? Yes, ma'am. They do still celebrate it today. What else? Oh, good. You're equally as clueless as I was before I started studying for this lesson. The Feast of Booths, it's one of the three major feasts that exists within one of the three major feasts that the Jews celebrated, where all men and all young men were required to attend. So you had three primary big ones of the Passover, Feast of Booths, and somebody help me, I'm forgetting the third one. What was the third one? Brother Parks, do you remember? Because I don't remember. There was a third one. Anyways, it's one of three essential feasts that everybody had to go to. Yes, ma'am. It's the same one. You may notice it's a little dark, but there's a tent right here because at least one scholar, referred to this as the Feast of Jewish Camping, or the Feast of Tents, the Feast of Jewish Camping, one of the two. Because part of the feast required that everyone camp outside of the temple walls. It was a feast that sought to celebrate and sought to focus upon the provision that God had provided as the Israelites moved through the wilderness. Thus the idea of sleeping in tents, because you may recall that the Jews had to, or the Israelites had to sleep and had to camp in such a way that they could quickly move things when it was time to move and when God told them to move. You may even recall that God led Israel through the wilderness in what two forms? You remember? There was one by day and one by night. There was a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Well, these tents were to be specially erected. There's a special building code, if you will, during the Feast of Booths, and you had to be able to see the sky through the roof of your dwelling, or through the roof of your hut, your makeshift dwelling, if you will, in order that you might see the sky and be reminded of how God had provided for Israel as they moved through the wilderness. So kind of this reenactment. It was a week-long feast. Not only were they to camp outside, but there was this procession that happened on a daily basis that involved moving towards the temple with everyone holding, let me make sure I get these words correct, with everyone holding an ephod in one hand and a lulav with the other hand. Now that means absolutely nothing to you, just as it meant absolutely nothing to me. But basically it's this, that you have citrus in one hand and you have these branches, these cuttings of a palm tree, a willow tree, and a myrtle tree. And each of these continued to symbolize God's providence. For the ephod, or this citrus here, it reminded the Israelites of how God had provided by blessing them with the recent harvest. For the Feast of Booths take place after the harvest, after everything's been gathered in. And so as Israel is celebrating, thank God for providing for our harvest, thank God for providing our needs, they're also remembering way back to the wilderness when God provided for them there as well. So this time of God has provided for us by providing for us in the wilderness, and he continues to provide for us by bringing us this harvest. And so this ephod, or this citrus, reminded them and celebrated the current harvest. The lulav, which is this, which would be either a palm tree, a willow tree, myrtle tree, symbolized Israel's journey through the wilderness. And so the focus of this entire week, the focus of this entire feast is upon how God has provided and how he has continued to provide and how he has sustained Israel throughout their history and how he continues to sustain them. This is the feast that is being celebrated and is the backdrop for which John chapter 7 occurs. With that backdrop in mind, I'd like us to work through one question together. And that is, in these first 13 verses, what do you think John wants us to see? What does he want us to recognize out of these first 13 verses? Recalling that John records everything for a specific purpose that we might come to believe. So what is it that he wants us to grasp? What is it that he wants us to see within these first 13 verses? I'm only going to give you a couple minutes to do it. We'll do group 1 and group 2. Go ahead. I told you I wasn't going to give you much time because we're going to make some progress in John chapter 7 today. I'm curious, what do you think John wants us to see? In these first 13 verses, what do you think is important for us to recognize as we move through John chapter 7? Group 1, what do you think?
I think, you know, the Feast of the Tabernacle was basically to establish God's relationship with Israel. Israel was was moving towards a monotheistic belief in God. That was what God wanted, a one God belief, because the other nations believed in multiple gods. An example, Moses' marriage, his first marriage, who was his first wife? I can't think of her name. He married a Cushite woman. Then his first wife was not of the tribe of Israel, and so she came into their relationship with a multiple God relationship. So I hope I'm answering the question. I think that in relationship to Moses' mission was that God here, by establishing the Feast of the Tabernacle, is establishing a relationship that Israel would have with God.
Okay. There's certainly an aspect with all of the feasts of building a relationship. Or it is interesting that all of the feasts call everyone to come to Jerusalem, to come to the place where God dwells, if you will. And there's something about eating a meal together that seems to grow camaraderie. In this case, it's eating a meal together with those who are your brothers and sisters in the presence of the one who has brought you together, that is God. So there was clearly an element of intentionality, of God intentionally drawing his people together so that he might increase their reliance and remind them of who he was. Somebody else, so what are we supposed to recognize from John chapter 7? What is it that John wants us to know? Okay, he wants our faith to grow. Is there anything in here that might help our faith to grow?
Urging people to go. You know, he says in verse 4, "For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." But Jesus literally turns around and says, "My time's not yet come yet." So I think if he shows everybody everything immediately, they will not believe him because it's too much.
Okay.
And so Jesus is like, I need to give them little bits at a time, like you were just mentioned with the whole milk to meat thing, where, you know, John's kind of being like, give them the whole meal. And Jesus is like, just no, they just need an appetizer right now. And
Okay.
so he's slowly feeding them who Jesus is.
Okay, there's an intentionality with how Christ chooses to reveal himself. Okay? Since you brought up the idea of my time is not yet come, what are the implications of Jesus saying my time has not yet come? What are the implications that he expresses that it's not yet time? Okay, that he's waiting. And what does that imply about Christ? What might it imply about his power and his ability? That he says, my time has not yet come. Okay, it would imply, one, that he's all-knowing and that he knows when his time will come. What else might it imply? One of the subtle undercurrents that we see throughout John is that Jesus picks when it is his time. So not only does he know, but it's not in the sense of it's coming along, oh, I guess it's a good time, but rather that Christ has the power to be able to decide when it is his time. For we'll see later on that, in fact, we'll see later at the end of this chapter that people try and seize him and they aren't able to because it's not his time. Yet later, spoiler alert, Jesus will be seized because it was his time. But the undercurrent in all of that was that it was Christ who was in control, and at no point was he out of control. So there's this aspect of not only does it show how Christ intentionally engaged us to grow our faith, but it even kind of grows our faith a little bit in that it wasn't something that just happened, but it was something that Christ remained in control of throughout. Okay? That's true. That's true. That's true. What else did John want us to know? What do you think? Who is the focus of or I guess I should ask the question more bluntly. Who told Jesus that he needs to go to the feast? His brothers. Now, okay, that makes sense in the sense that all Jewish men were supposed to go to the feast. But that's not really their stated reason. Now, what is their stated reason for sending him to the feast? Okay? How so? That it could very easily read as a calling of the bluff, if you will. If you say you're so great, you say you've done all these things, but you know who you haven't done it before? You haven't done it before the PhDs of the Jewish society, who were going to be at the feast, by the way. So why don't you go down there? If you really are all you say you are, if you really can do all the things that you say you can, and they would want to know it, they would want to see it, why don't you go show them now? That's true. That they don't follow Christ until later, and eventually they do. They don't really believe, which is the whole idea of calling bluff, right? Which only serves to highlight the uncertainty as to who Jesus is, which might be one of the things that John is trying to draw our attention to, of the uncertainty of, okay, who is this guy? In fact, there's so much talk that it seems to be the talk of the feast, of who exactly is this Jesus, almost as if John is asking us the same basic question of who have you arrived at the conclusion that he is? Who is this Jesus? Now, there is another way to view what Jesus' brothers do, and I'm not sure which is true. Either way, they don't believe in him. The other is that they kind of have an inkling what the Jews are going to do to him, and they send him there anyways. Because the text does read they don't believe in him, and the text even sets up the reason why Jesus wasn't going, because the Jews were seeking to kill him. If we read further, it appears that some knew that the Jews were trying to kill him, and some didn't. So it's unclear as to whether or not his brothers actually know or not, but it's certainly possible that they've just gotten irritated with him, because it's their older brother. And can you imagine your older brother being Jesus? Talk about a sibling rivalry. He never does anything wrong. He never gets in trouble. We're just so tired of this guy. Well, why don't you just go down to Jerusalem? They're looking for you anyways. Either way, his brothers don't believe in him, which serves to highlight the uncertainty as to who Jesus is, and perhaps draws our attention in to ask the question, why have they not recognized? What is it that they're not seeing? What is Jesus' response to the assertion by his brothers that he needs to go to the feast? Adam, you already said it. He said it's not his time, and that he's not going to go to the feast. But what does Jesus do? He does go to the feast later on. Now, how does he go to the feast? So he goes secretly. Now, I read at least one or two individuals who like to ask the question, so does this mean that Jesus lied? Because he says he's not going to go, and then he decides to go. If somebody were to ask you that question, how do you think you would respond? Say again? I would want to embrace the sarcastic side of myself and say, oh, you've never changed your mind. You've always been right about everything. But I would try and resist that. It is quite possible that Jesus changes his mind. It's not outside of the realm of possibility. God does at times seem to change his mind throughout at certain points in Scripture. But it's not the only way to understand it. The other way to understand it is that Jesus tells his brothers, I'm not going to go in the same way that you are. That I'm not going in the way that you are at this moment, in a public kind of way, in the way that you're suggesting that I should go. Which is why John then highlights and emphasizes that Jesus goes, but he goes privately. That Jesus is not saying, I'm not ever going to go to the feast, but that I'm not going up right now with you guys in the way that you want it to be. I'm not going up in this grand procession. I'll go up later. Either way, in my opinion, it's a somewhat irrelevant discussion. And yet he does. And yet he does. With God, we can almost always see this almost opposites kind of idea. that Jesus does nothing. He makes it very clear that I didn't come just to draw everybody's attention, and yet he explicitly states, I've come to draw all men. That there's this element of both. At the end, I believe it's verse 13. Make sure. At the end of this section, actually in verses 10 through 13, we read the following. But after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he went up, not publicly but in private. The Jews were looking for him at the feast and saying, where is he? And there was much muttering among the people. While some said, he is a good man, others said, no, he is leading the people astray. Yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. I want you to notice the two groups. You have the Jews and the people are muttering amongst themselves. Question, who are the people? So why does it say that the Jews were wanting to kill him, but the people were muttering? Why not say the Jews were looking to kill him and the Jews were muttering? Okay, maybe there's some believers, but if that's the case, then why weren't all the people saying, no, we should believe in him? Because the people even seemed, well, we're not sure what to do with him. So we have the Jews looking to kill him and the people muttering amongst themselves as to what we're supposed to do about this. What is the difference? Because the people are Jews. What'd you say, Brother Ralph? It's an important distinction as we read through John, that we'll see the word the Jews, and the Jews were doing this, and the Jews were doing that, and the Jews were doing this. Most of the time when John is referring to the Jews, he is specifically referring to and highlighting the Jewish leaders, which is why here's the distinction between the Jews, those who were leading the Jews, and the people who also were Jewish, discussing amongst themselves. But it's an important distinction as you read through that when you see Jews, recognize that it's the Jewish leaders who are being referenced. In other words, Jesus' opponents. Any questions before we move on? Yes.
Kind of a massive eternal eruption going on within the Jewish state, the Jewish leadership state.
We do see this great turmoil, and what are we supposed to do with this individual, and how are we supposed to address him? Yeah, we'll ask a question. Were the Jewish leaders right in questioning what Jesus was doing and what he was saying? What do you think? Of course they were. It was their task, it was their responsibility to make sure that whatever was taught was in accordance with the law, was in accordance to what they had what they had within their Bible, what they had learned from Moses and from the prophets. It was their responsibility to make sure that what was being taught was from God. Which leads to the question, why then did they not move faster to arrest Jesus? Because if they were truly doing what they were supposed to be doing, which was, that is, watching and making sure that everything that was taught to the Jewish people was correct, why then did they not move and arrest Jesus faster? Unless perhaps their motive was a little bit different. Now, John makes it very, very clear that ultimately the Jewish leaders will miss who Jesus is, and that Jesus did enough miracles and had shown that he had been prophesied about and referenced how he had fulfilled prophecy. Jesus makes it very, very clear that the Jewish leaders had no excuse. But to ask questions of Jesus was a fair thing for them to do. To want to make sure that he really was from God was a fair thing to do, but it begs the question, if they didn't think that he was, why did they wait? Because if they didn't think that he was from God, they should have moved faster. Either way, the focus then becomes, there's this turmoil, but why is there this turmoil? Not only because they're trying to wrestle with who Jesus is, but also because they're trying to wrestle with what are the implications for us and for our power. In other words, they're more concerned about the people who are around them and what they think of them than they are what they're supposed to be doing. Any other thoughts or comments before we move on? Yes, ma'am. It's true. You're right. that even within that group, the Jews, the Jewish leaders, we know of specifically at least one in John, Nicodemus, who is asking questions within this group. And so one of the questions of Nicodemus is, well, which group is he in? Is he with the Jews? Is he not with the Jews? It's one of the questions to be asked. But you're right that there were some who were adamantly against Jesus, and there were some within the Jewish leadership who were asking questions and questioning. But John still poses the question, who chose to follow Jesus and who did not? Yes, sir.
Did some of it also have to do with the Roman occupation as well? They didn't want to rile the feathers of the Romans?
Certainly, though the Jews were okay with riling the Romans because they'd already done it 2 times prior to this. But certainly they want to do it in such a way that they're not just squashed and annihilated, because the Romans had a real tendency to be very unkind and very unforgiving when it came to rebellion. And they tried to squash it pretty hard. So you can imagine how, especially at feasts and things, the tensions would already be high. And so what are we supposed to do with this individual? When should we best approach it? When should we best deal with things? But you're right. And inevitably, some of the discussion would have revolved around how Jesus would impact the Roman occupation and how that should impact the response. Anything else? All right. If I can get somebody to read verses 14 through 31.
About the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, "How is it that this man has learning when he has never studied?" And so Jesus answered them, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I'm speaking of my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me?" And the crowd answered, "You have a demon. Who's seeking to kill you?" And Jesus answered them, "I did one work, and you all marvel at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it's from Moses, but from the fathers, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? Do not judge by appearance, but judge by what is right judgment." Some of the people at Jerusalem therefore said, "Is not this the man whom they seek to kill? And here he is speaking openly, and they say nothing to him. Can it be that the authorities really know that this is the Christ? But we know where this man comes from, and when the Christ appears, no one will know where he comes from." So Jesus proclaimed as he taught in the temple, "You know me, and you know where I come from, but I have not come of my own accord. He who sent me is true, and him who you do not know. I know him, for I came from him, and he sent me." So they were seeking to arrest him, but no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. Yet many of the people believed in him, and they said, "When the Christ appears, will he do more signs than this man has done?"
All right, thank you. If you had to summarize this section in like a single sentence, how would you summarize what takes place and what Jesus says? If you had to summarize everything in this section, everything Jesus says and everything that occurs, how would you summarize it in like a single sentence? Yes, sir.
God sent me, but you don't believe that.
Okay. God sent me, you don't believe that. That's essentially the message of it. Any other way that you might summarize it? I get somebody to read verse 26 for me one more time, please.
And here he is speaking openly, and they say nothing to him. Can it be that the authorities really know that this is the Christ?
Oh, sorry, verse 24. Oops.
Do not judge by appearance, but judge with right judgment.
If I had to summarize everything that was being said, I would do a paraphrase of verse 24. Because, Chris, you're right. Basically, the message is, I'm from God and you don't believe it. And here, Jesus seems to be saying, you guys can't see well. You're blind. You guys can't see well enough to see that I am from God. And he even points out one specific way in which he highlights you guys can't see correctly, period. And it's with regards to the law of Moses. What does he say about the Jews and their current relationship to the law of Moses? That they don't keep it. And what evidence does he utilize to support that accusation? Because it's a bold accusation to tell those under the law, y'all don't keep the law. To tell those Jews whose sole purpose was to keep the law and their covenant relationship with them and telling them, you guys don't keep the Mosaic law, that's a bold accusation. Yes, sir.
Not do stuff on the Sabbath, but then you also perform a circumcision on the Sabbath to keep Moses' law. And would that not be a work?
Okay. He does utilize that to show, okay, you guys, here's an example of how you guys aren't seeing clearly. If you guys say it's okay to do circumcision on the Sabbath, which circumcision was a vital part of the law, you had to be circumcised to be a Jew. But he's saying, you guys have elevated this aspect of the law, but you're breaking the Sabbath. Now you're accusing me of breaking the Sabbath, but I'm doing things that are good. I'm healing. Side note, you may remember in John chapter 5 where Jesus heals the man, the invalid at the pool of Siloam on the Sabbath. That's what he's referring back to. That all these people said, man, you healed on the Sabbath 6 months ago. 6 months ago, by the way. 6 months ago, you healed on the Sabbath. How dare you do such a thing? Because that's violating the Sabbath. And Jesus says, well, you're really not evaluating this well. You guys do things that you believe to be right and are right on the Sabbath. But here you're accusing me of violating the Sabbath when I healed a whole person. That doesn't jive. In other words, here's another example of how you're not seeing well. You're not able to see well, and so you're not able to come up with a valid, just opinion. But going back to the law of Moses, he's made an accusation. You don't keep the law of Moses. What is the evidence that he presents? You're going to say, you don't keep the law of Moses, and then he's going to immediately say something else. What does he say? To paraphrase, y'all bunch of murderers. Because what he says is, y'all are seeking to kill me. Now, it does imply that Jesus knows things and knows all things, but it also seems to be somewhat common knowledge, for we'll read later how some of them recognized, oh, isn't this the one who the Jews are seeking to kill? So clearly some knew about it. And Jesus says, you all are seeking to kill me. Do you remember in the Ten Commandments, I seem to remember one of the Ten Commandments expressing, thou shalt not murder. And so what Jesus is saying here is, you guys have shown, because you're looking to murder me, you have shown that you do not keep the Mosaic law, that you do not keep it as you should. So therefore, you do not see clearly. And you can't see clearly even well enough to determine what is right and what is wrong on the Sabbath. And because you don't see clearly, you are unable to see me. Unable to see whom I am from. Unable to see that what I speak has been given to me from God. You are unable to see clearly because you become blind by what you do. Anybody else have a different summation and a different way you would look at this text? Yes, ma'am? He does call them hypocrites. If you're saying one thing and doing something else, he does absolutely do so. Anything else? Jesus expresses that they are so blind that they can't see clearly. I had a conversation with Brother Parks when I was getting ready to do this lesson, and he pointed out something I thought was important. Remember we said that this feast, the feast that is the backdrop amongst everything that takes place, what is it celebrating? What is the Feast of Tabernacles? What is the Feast of Booths celebrating? It is celebrating God's provision because it occurs after the harvest, how God has provided in the midst of the harvest. And it's also hearkening back to the wilderness, how God provided in the midst of the wilderness. That the entire week that is the backdrop of John chapter 7 is a celebration of how God has provided for his people. Question: who is it that is standing amongst them speaking at the moment? Say again? Okay. The provider, God himself, stands amongst them, the one who has been providing them, who has continually provided them. And not only does he, the provider, stand before them, he, the provider, is the provision that has been made. The greatest provision that has ever been made is standing before them, and they are unable to see it. This entire week they've celebrated God's provision. And the greatest provision that God had ever made was standing before them, but because they were so blind, they were unable to see it and unable to recognize it. Why were they unable to recognize Jesus? Well, why were they blind, you think? What is it that was resulting in their blindness? What do you think? What helped bring that blindness about? One we read a couple weeks ago, and will appear again in John chapter 7. That there's a familiarity with Christ. For the question's asked, wait a minute, isn't this the son of the carpenter? Isn't this Joseph and Mary's son? Don't we remember him growing up? In other words, they thought that they knew who God was. They thought that they knew who Jesus was, and so they'd arrived at the conclusion, we already know. And so they were a little bit blind. The other thing we notice is that they're willing to obey God, but not when it's inconvenient. For you guys have talked about how there was this turmoil in amongst the Jewish leadership of what does Jesus mean, and what's going to happen with the Romans, and what does it mean for our power. It was an inconvenient time. It would have been really convenient to remove the one who was causing all the issues. It would have been a really convenient time to just kill him and get it done with, which is essentially what their plan is. Let's kill him, let's remove it, let's get rid of this inconvenience here. But in so doing, they would violate the Mosaic law by committing murder. That by only obeying God when it was convenient seems to have contributed to their blindness. So there seem to be at least two things combining that made it hard for them to see. One, their willingness to only obey God when it was convenient. And two, their arrival at the conclusion that we already know. We already know who this man is. We already know who God is. We already know how everything's supposed to happen. And this isn't it, so this can't be the one. And the result is that they missed God who was in amongst them, God's greatest provision standing there before them. We have 2 minutes left. We were going to do this as group work, and that is, how can we have soft seeing hearts? What do we recognize within this text? What might we learn in this text of how we might have soft seeing hearts? For ultimately, what we see with the Jews is their hearts were so hard that they were blind and they were unable to recognize Christ and unable to recognize God's provision for them, even as they celebrated God's provision. And so the question that we are to ask is, how can we avoid having hard, blind hearts? How instead can we have soft seeing hearts? And from this text, I think there's a couple things that we can see. One, be careful to whom you listen, because the Jewish leaders were the ones determined to work against Christ, work against Jesus. And those were the ones who the Jews were listening to, who would ultimately influence all the people to say, crucify him, crucify him. That we need to be careful who exactly we're listening to. Secondly, we need to listen and meditate upon the word. Not just simply read through it and, okay, we already know the answer, but instead meditate. What does the word say? What is it trying to communicate? Is there anything here that I haven't seen before? Is what I believe to be true still true based upon what I see? To read and meditate upon the word. To three, that we are to practice obedience, especially when it's inconvenient. For it seems that the practice of what we read in Scripture ultimately is what either softens or hardens our heart. It's not simply reading of the word, but the doing of the word. And we see here the hearts of the Jews being hardened because of their willingness to only obey when it was convenient. That if we're to have soft hearts, hearts that can see, we are to practice obedience even when it is inconvenient. And we have to evaluate our bias. In other words, we have to evaluate what are the things that I already assume to be true. Based on what I see in the text, are those still true? We cannot fall into the trap of assuming we already know all there is to know. But instead, continually ask the question, is what I thought to be true, what I believe to be true, still true based upon what I see within the text? Let's pray and we'll be done. Heavenly Father, we are so thankful for your Son. We're so thankful for your providing him for us, so thankful for sending him that we might have life with you. Lord, we ask that you help us to have soft hearts, hearts that hear your word and do your word, hearts that long to see you. Lord, we love you and wait to be with you in Christ's name.